السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
May the peace of God be upon you.
حدثكم الدكتور سيف صالح السياري.
So this is Dr. Saif Saleh Al-Sari, Executive Officer, Dhaka, United Arab Emirates. Allow me now to switch to English.
So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dr. Saif Al-Sari. I'm Executive Officer at the Dhaka Abu Dhabi National Energy Company. I spent most of my career in the energy sector, starting with ADNOC, more than 12, 13 years in the oil and gas sector. After I did my studies in US, France, and UK, all in petroleum engineering, I then moved to Dhaka, which is Abu Dhabi National Energy Company, which has a very, very diversified portfolio internationally. We own and operate 12 different assets in different countries, all the way from India to Canada. And we are the either major shareholders or the 100% owner of all these fields in the oil and gas business, power, water, gas storage, renewables, and so on. The main challenges of this discussions today are not very necessarily subsurface. We are going to have a very interesting discussion today with the great panelists around many other challenges that faces the energy sector. So I would want to give a very, very brief description and introduction of the very long biology of my colleagues here today, who has been in this sector for a long time. And I would want to, unfortunately, we could not host Dr. Elspeth Thompson, who hasn't been able to travel from Canada. So I'll start briefly with Dr. Sarah Vakhshuri, an internationally recognized expert on energy markets and security. She has more than a decade of experience in global energy market studies, energy security, and geopolitical risk. She has been a visiting fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, and Dr. Vakhshuri has experience of working in both the public and private sectors of the Iranian energy industry, and has traveled and worked extensively in the Middle East region, India, and North America. She has published articles in The Economist, Middle East Economics Survey, and oil and gas journals, and in many others very reputed journals and papers. And she is going to talk to us about the Iran potentialities and implications of a full return to the energy market. I then would want to welcome Dr. Jack Sharpless, who is a lecturer in energy politics at the European University of St. Petersburg in the Russian Federation, where he also teaches European Union politics in the Department of Political Science and Sociology. And he administers the International MA in Russian and Eurasian Studies. He has been the author of Monthly Gazprom Monitor since May 2012. Dr. Sharpless has published articles on the Russian approaches to energy security and climate change, and the role of Russia in European energy security, and is the author of regular shorter publications and comments to the media. His current research interests include European Union, Russian energy relations, Russian foreign and domestic energy policy, energy security, energy geopolitics, sustainable energy strategies, and EU policies. It's a very difficult to shorten the CVs, the bios of all the great work that has been done by my colleagues here do their career and how remarkable outcomes that they've seen and came to. But I'll let them speak for themselves today, starting with Dr. Sarah. If you please. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, or I would like to say sisters and brothers. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I would like to thank the conference organizers and the center to invite me here and to give me the opportunity to speak here at this prestigious conference. Also, I would like to thank for their hospitality that makes us feel welcome and so warm in the beautiful state of Abu Dhabi, and they really welcome us like their sisters and brothers. As Dr. Saif also, I would like to thank him for a kind introduction. He mentioned that the topic of my talk is potentials and implications of full return of Iran to the energy market. It's a very timely topic, of course. We are sitting now here. There is an ongoing talk between Iran and P5+1. The last talk before the deadline of the negotiations currently is ongoing in Vienna. Combined with this, we have a 30% of oil price plunge in the market because of mainly the oversupply. The oversupply in the market that caused by the lower consumption growth, mainly because of the economic crisis in many countries and lower economic growth, and also the higher efficiency. So the lower demand and higher production from particularly North America caused the oversupply in the market. And now we are going to talk about the full return of Iran, one of the biggest OPEC producers at some point, with huge reserves, and how this is going to affect the market. I would like to start with Iran's 5-year investment plan and its upstream energy. So Iran defines every 5-year plan, every 5-year plan. This is the latest one from 2011 to 2015. Iran was planning to have $255 billion of investment in its upstream to reach to the goals that it has for its production capacity, both in natural gas and crude oil, in upstream, midstream, and petrochemical industries. Well, there is not an exact number, but of course Iran could not reach to the target investment plan, mainly because of the sanctions that they have been accelerated and expanded because of Iran's nuclear conflict. So just to start with here, saying that Iran did not really reach its investment plan. We all know that Iran has a new president, and since last year, Iran's petroleum ministry changed. But this change has a significant effect on Iran's energy industry. Mr. Zangina, the new oil minister, who was the minister before and a previous term too, he's a very well-educated, knowledgeable person. He has a great team in his staff that they have worked during the war, during the sanctions. So psychologically, they're prepared to work under the tough pressure and hard times. Plus, he is a person who is called Sheikh of Ministers in Iran. So we have a Sheikh of Ministers. He was minister for 20 years, and he has this reputation wherever he went, he built that place. So for crude oil, his target for this round of minister, his first 4 years, was to increase Iran's production capacity, crude oil production capacity, to its pre-sanction level of 4 million barrels per day. Again, here I would like to mention production capacity, because increasing the production capacity doesn't mean that Iran necessarily is going to produce 4 million barrels. How much is Iran's current production capacity? Iranian officials didn't say it. They don't know it because Iran cannot already produce at this maximum level. There are different numbers. So our anticipation is that Iran's current production capacity is between 3.5 to 3.7 million barrels a day. And his target is to reach this to 4 million barrels a day. Export, of course, Zanganeh's target is to increase Iran's export to the pre-sanction level, which was its official OPEC quota of 2.5 million barrels a day. On natural gas, Iran has huge resources of natural gas, second after Russia. However, Iran's share in the global gas market is less than 1%. So Iran really doesn't have a significant export of natural gas, just have a little bit to its neighboring country, to Turkey, importing the same amount that is exporting. Main reason for that, high domestic consumption, also could not expand its production capacity above that level. To export, Iran has lost the opportunity to gain any share in the LNG market at the current time. It's going to take at least 8 years for Iran to send its first LNG cargo. And by that time, Iran has lost the LNG market. So we think that Iran's main focus will be on exporting its natural gas through pipeline and to its neighboring countries. So UAE, Bahrain, Iraq, Kuwait, these are the countries that Iran could target to gain market share and sell its natural gas to these countries. On the petrochemical side, the day that in 1997, the first time that Zanganeh took office, Iran's worth of petrochemical production, the value of it was $1 billion, I'm sorry. And the day that he left after 8 years, Iran's value of petrochemical production was, which is still is $18 billion. So that's what a raise we see. That's what happened. He is focusing a lot on petrochemical industry, and he's going to focus more because he believes that petrochemical industry is going to add value to Iran's natural gas and oil, of course. And especially at the time that there is an oversupply of crude oil and Iran cannot get easily a share in the gas market. On the petroleum products, particularly the sanctions on Iran's gasoline, which was a bottleneck for Iran, Iran imports a huge amount of gasoline. It's interesting that how I always remember Iran's gasoline consumption per day. Iran's population is 70 million people. And gasoline consumption is around 70 million liters a day. So it's like, imagine each Iranian is per average a day, they're using 1 liter of gasoline. It goes up and down. Iran was successful to a certain degree to reduce the subsidies on its gasoline fuel, not to reduce its consumption, but to prevent further growth. And by the new refineries, particularly the project that they have, they call it Persian Gulf Star. If the Persian Gulf Star comes to the full production, by 2017, Iran is going to export gasoline. And this is something that Iran can do it under the sanctions because they already spent the money, they invested the money, and it doesn't require a complicated technology. But Iran has, of course, challenges. In my talk before the price oil drop in October, there were only two challenges, sanctions and upstream investment regulations. But the low oil prices added another major challenge for Iranian oil industry. So we all know that sanctions prevents any capital or technology to enter to Iranian oil industry. The sanction extensively on Iranian oil industry increased since 2012. And since 2012, really no investment or technology entered to Iran, and many companies had to leave Iranian oil industry. The other issue for Iran was on upstream investment regulations. Many of you that you are working in upstream, you know that production sharing contracts or close to this type of contracts is what IOCs and international oil companies are interested in. However, because in Iran's constitution, the foreign ownership of assets, including crude oil, is banned, Zanganeh had to introduce a new investment regulation, which is buyback. Well, of course, buyback were not new service contracts, but it was very new to using buyback contracts in the upstream regulations. So Iran still, with the buyback and with the ILSA sanction, no longer on Libya, Iran Sanction Act, ISA sanction, Zangin and his team, they could attract still $15 billion of investment. But this is not enough. So they have announced that they're going to change their investment regulation to Iran Petroleum Contracts, IPC they called it, is not production sharing. So they are hoping that Iran's parliament is not going to protest the new investment regulation, but is very close to the type of contracts that are used in Iraq, even better. So basically, the length of the contracts are longer, the fees and the costs are more flexible. There are more flexibility and more time that the IOC could be involved in Iran's energy industry. You could, the center has the slides. I'm not going through the details unless any of the audience has questions later, but there is a comparison between how the buyback, the previous system, is going to be different from the new system. Something that is really significant in the new type of contracts is to involving the IOC in the production process. Iran jealously was protecting its production process since the revolution, that only NIOC was involving in the production process. But now the foreign companies can also help Iran marketing, selling the production of the fields. I would like to talk about sanctions. So if we hear in the news at the end of this week that Iran has reached an agreement with P5+1, what this means for Iran's energy industry. We know that Iran's energy industry are targeted by different types of sanctions. Sanctions from EU and United Nations, sanctions that are set by US. So what we think, after debating so much, going to Congress, running from Congress to State Department, talking to European Union and people at UN, what we anticipate is that under the scenario that Iran reaches to a full agreement with P5+1, the UN sanctions and the EU sanctions are the first one to ease on Iran. And those are the sanctions that are mainly targeting Iran's export, oil export. So if UN and EU sanctions on Iran's insurance, shipping, and transaction for its crude oil sale ease, Iran is going to increase its production around 500 to 600 barrels, 1,000 barrels per day within 3 to 6 months. So that's their capability. So the market is going to have 500 to 600,000 barrels of oil extra within 3 to 6 months of an agreement and sanction lift. But what about the US sanctions? US has set different types of sanctions since 1996 on Iran's oil industry. The first one that you see a big red cross on it, Iran Sanction Act, previously was ILSA, Iran-Libya Sanction Act, that was set on 1996 on Iran's energy industry, is banning any investment more than $20 million in Iran's energy industry. We all know that this sanction broke by Total of France. That was the first company to come to Iran and saying that American rules are American, they're not applied to Europeans. So European companies came to Iran, US companies are still not in Iran, they couldn't go to Iran. So we don't think that Iran Sanction Act is going to be waived at all. The reason for that is that US Congress imposed the Iran Sanction Act on Iran because of supporting terrorists and not nuclear program. So any sanction on Iran's energy industry or any different sectors, those sanctions are going to reduce only that are set because of Iran's nuclear program and not the Iran Sanctions Act. So we are not expecting American companies nor American persons to enter Iran if Iran reaches to an agreement. There are 3 different sanctions. The first one, by short, we call it CISADA. CISADA sanctions was mainly on exporting gasoline to Iran. This is something that could be easily removed. Iran threat action of 2012 that is expanding the ISIS sanctions and more involvement of foreign companies and investment into Iranian oil industry, which is a more secondary sanctions and more applied on the other non-American companies. This could be relieved. And the last one is National Defense Authorization Act sanction of Iran. That's on Iran's foreign assets that are frozen, financial institution and central bank. This could be also waived. Is the Congress going to waive? Is the president going to veto what happened? The new Congress of US is has a different leadership, have lots of differences with president. What is going to happen to U.S. if even U.S. do not relieve any of these sanctions on Iran? Still, European companies can go to Iran, and still Iran can increase its export if it reaches to an agreement with P5+1. So what will happen if Iran returns to the energy market? Of course, its crude oil production and export capacity is going to expand. Iran's natural gas production and capacity going to expand, and refined products, gasoline particularly. Iran is planning to export gasoline by 2017, or at least being self-independent and not importing further gasoline to the country, and also its petrochemical production. And how it's going to affect the market? Of course, on the crude oil side, there's going to be harder price competition in the market. Iran is going to gain share in the market, looking for new shares. Already lost a lot of market share because of the sanctions, and Saudi Arabia is the major substitute for Iranian oil. So most of Iran's market share has gone already for Saudi. We know that Saudi is not going to reduce its production sometime soon, because that's how they are reducing their budgetary gaps, and by producing more, they are filling the gap of the profit loss due to the price plunge. What will happen in OPEC? Can OPEC reach to an agreement to reduce their production? Of course, Iran is not going to agree, saying that I have lost my market share for a decade. It was Iranian ministers some months ago that said Iran is going to increase its production even if the prices of oil drop to $20. So we're expecting that the conflict in the OPEC could increase further. For Iraq, Iranian majority are Shia, so Iranian have a 12th Imam. So they have this famous slang, they say that the hidden hands of the 12th Imam always help us. And here, the presence of ISIS in Iraq is kind of a good help for Iran, because Iraq's market is very unsecure, and there are lots of risks involved with investing in Iraq. So if Iraq is not an attractive market, Iran will hope that at the time that investing in non-conventional oil is not profitable, companies could come once again back to Iran for investing in this country. What will happen for U.S. shale oil production? We had lots of discussion yesterday. The shale oil production, in my view, is going to continue because American had invested long time. They're not going to give up working on their technology, working on production of shale oil, but if the prices plunge further, of course, the production of shale oil might reduce to a certain degree. What will happen on the natural gas side? Of course, again, we're going to have price competition. Iran, for gaining back shares in the oil or gas market, is going to offer further discounts. The prices could drop further. Export through pipeline versus LNG is the best option that Iranians are going to follow up very soon. Again, that would be with their neighboring countries that Iran could easily expand in the export market, and this could create new ties, new trade ties. Export of natural gas, unlike crude oil, is a long-term business, whether if it's pipeline or LNG, and that's the best way for Iran to secure its new trade and strategic ties with its customers. So natural gas would be the future of Iran. So how this, in general, going to affect? We think that Iran is not going to expand its crude oil production capacity more than 4 million barrels a day. The reason for that is Iran knows that market doesn't need any more oil. They're seeing themselves more as a gas-producing country. That's something that Iraq doesn't have, Iran has. So they are focusing on natural gas because that will help their petrochemical factories more. They can produce more gasoline, of course, and light distillate refined products from their natural gas. Their condensate will increase by the increase of their production, gasoline production. So for them, we'll have more export values. We think that Iran is going to work with the market. So they're not going to want $20 per barrel of crude oil. So they might not want to increase their production further than what the market wants, and that's 500 more. I'm going to stop here. I know my colleague has interesting topic to discuss after this, and looking forward to the discussion after the panels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was a very informative and interesting discussion. Before we move into Jack's presentation, in case of having any questions, we will have a session after Jack's presentation. We'll have a panel discussion and Q&As. So please hold on to any questions that you might have for Sarah or for someone else after Jack's. So please, to you, Jack.
Dear colleagues, Salam alaikum. I would like to begin by actually echoing the sentiments of my colleagues by saying thank you so much to the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research, not only for the invitation and the opportunity to come here and be with you and speak, but also for the wonderful hospitality that we have received since we arrived. Really, you have made us feel most welcome, so I would like to thank you for that. I would also like to add that you have a beautiful research institute located in a beautiful city, so really it's a pleasure to be here. Today, I'm going to be speaking about the issue of Russian gas supplies to Europe, and in particular, the potential impact of an interruption in gas transit via Ukraine. I would like to begin by giving credit where credit is due, and that is to my co-author, Dr. Andrew Judge. Dr. Judge was previously at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, in Scotland. He is currently working at the European Court of Auditors. We wrote a paper back in March 2014 examining this issue just at the time as the crisis in Crimea was kicking off. And essentially what we looked at was the question of the impact on European gas importers if the delivery of Russian gas via Ukraine were suspended. And what we looked at really was an analysis of import dependency of different European countries, cross-border flows and capacity connections, gas storage capacities and actual storage levels, and also the access to alternative sources. Now, at the time, we came to the conclusion that European states are actually much better prepared than they were in January 2009, the time of the last major gas crisis in Europe. And that only really Bulgaria and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia stand out as being particularly vulnerable energy islands. Now, since March, the situation has changed somewhat, and that is why I'm going to be giving this presentation today. We've updated our research, and this is the scenario that we're working with at the moment. The estimated debt of Naftogaz, which is the state-owned gas importer that has its contracts with Gazprom, imports Russian gas. The debts that Naftogaz has to Gazprom are estimated at around $4.5 billion. It could be somewhat lower, it could be somewhat higher. The reason for this is that while the volumes imported by Naftogaz over the last 12 months are agreed, they have been disputing the price at which they have been purchasing gas from Gazprom. And so they would like to see not only a renegotiation of the price for future deliveries, but also the price that is used to calculate their debts to Gazprom. Now, at the end of October, Gazprom and Naftogaz agreed what is called the winter package. Essentially, back in the summer in June, Gazprom switched to a prepayment mode of relations with Naftogaz, whereby Naftogaz would only receive gas from Gazprom if it paid for that gas in advance. The practical result was that Naftogaz simply stopped importing Russian gas from Gazprom. However, as we moved towards the winter, there were concerns that Ukraine would simply not have enough gas to last through the winter, that they didn't have enough in storage, and that they were going to need some Russian gas imports. At the end of October, they agreed the winter package with Gazprom, in which they agreed to pay off $3.1 billion of their debts in two tranches, so the first immediately and the second by the end of 2014. In return, Gazprom will supply 2 BCM of natural gas in November and again in December, but further deliveries will depend on Naftogaz paying its debts. And what I have here in the quotation marks is a quote from the Russian Energy Minister, Alexander Novak, saying that if Kiev fails to pay off the second tranche this $1.65 billion, then we will stop the supplies in January. It's stipulated in the agreement. There are no risks for the Russian side or for Gazprom, but if the debt is paid off, there will be deliveries. So essentially, today, the paper as it stands, this presentation, is based upon the scenario of what if gas deliveries to Europe via Ukraine are suspended in January? What if Naftogaz fails to pay its debts to Gazprom? Gazprom cuts off supplies to Naftogaz, and there is some impact, some interruption of gas transit via Ukraine as well as Russian gas deliveries to Ukraine. I would like to stress that this isn't a prophecy of doom for the European gas market. This isn't an expectation of what we think will happen. It's rather more the approach of hope for the best but prepare for the worst. It's better that we be informed and aware of the situation to respond to it appropriately should the worst happen. Now, during my short presentation, I will actually be making 4 key points. The first 2 will touch upon the nature of the gas market in Europe and relations with Russia, and then the second 2, how a crisis could be dealt with. So the first point is simply that Central and Southeastern Europe is much more dependent on Russian gas imports than the EU average, and is highly dependent on Ukrainian gas transit. A lot of what you read will talk about EU-Russia gas relations, but actually the issue of dependency on Russian gas imports is rather more regionally specific within Europe. So the statistics here will tell us that last year, EU gas import dependence was around 63%. Other statistics suggest around 66%. But in principle, the European Union imports around 2/3 of the gas that it consumes. And Russia supplies approximately 1/3 of those imports, giving Russia a share of approximately 1/5, maybe 1/4 of EU gas consumption. However, if we consider Central and Eastern Europe, so Australia, Bulgaria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Greece, Hungary, Macedonia, Poland, Romania, Serbia, Slovakia, and Slovenia taken together as a single geographical entity, we can see that their average levels of gas import dependence are closer to 78%, so higher than the European average. That Russia is the source of around 68% of their imports, which is twice the EU average, and that the share of Russian gas in their gas consumption is just over 50%, maybe 55%, so again more than twice the EU average. So what we have here is an explanation of how Russian gas is delivered to Europe. And as you can see, there are 3 principal routes. The first being via the Nord Stream pipeline under the Baltic Sea. The second being via Belarus and onward through Poland to Germany. And then finally via Ukraine. And what we can see is that the gas transit capacity is greatest via Ukraine. And then what we did was we took data from the IEA gas trade flows to find out exactly how much gas flowed through these different routes, both in 2012, in 2013, and then, for comparative purposes, January 2014. This is working on the basis that European gas demand is rather stable, and that the climatic conditions in January 2015 may be approximately those of January 2014. Obviously, it's not precise. But what we can see is that Ukraine accounts for around 55 to 58% of Russian gas deliveries to Europe. So clearly, the Ukrainian route is still key. And there we have a little more detail, let's say. Now, if we're looking at this in even more detail at the level of individual European states, we can see that there are distinctions in the routes by which Russian gas is delivered to European countries. So the southern route via Romania onward to Bulgaria and then Greece and Macedonia, as we can see from the map here, the southern route. A middle route via Hungary and onward to Serbia and Croatia. And then a northern route via Slovakia, onward to the Czech Republic, Austria, Slovenia, and Italy. So essentially what we're looking at is, once the gas has passed through Ukraine, where does it go? Also, Poland has small amounts of Russian gas imports via Ukraine, directly across the border from Ukraine, but this is a small percentage of what Poland imports. And it's also interesting to note that in January 2014, despite, as it may appear on the map here, Germany was actually a net gas exporter to the Czech Republic during this period. So if we want to measure the dependency of these states on Russian gas, and in particular transit via Ukraine, then the data is here. So if I can draw your attention to the boxes shaded in red, on the left here in table 1, we have the average levels of gas import dependency of these states. The total is what the level of gas import dependency would be if all of these countries were grouped together as a single geographical entity. But again, just to reiterate, it's quite clear that this region is more dependent on Russian gas imports than the European average. And if I draw your attention to the table on the right, we can see that they're also highly dependent on Ukrainian gas transit, and that indeed the Russian gas delivered to these states, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of it will pass via Ukraine. So clearly for these states, it's a very important issue. Key point number 2, the dependency doesn't only come from the European side. Russia itself is also rather dependent on Ukrainian gas transit and has limited alternative capacity for deliveries to Europe. So again, what we have here is data from the IEA gas trade flows, basically illustrating how Russian gas is delivered to Europe, the various routes. So again, this is measured in million cubic meters per day. So what we have here at the top is Nord Stream, and then via Belarus, via the Yamal Europe and the Beltransgas infrastructure, and then beneath via Ukraine. And again, I will draw your attention very particularly to the figures shaded in red, in that in January 2014, the flows via Ukraine amounted to around 225 million cubic meters per day, but the spare capacity on non-Ukrainian routes was only around 63 million cubic meters per day, which therefore leaves around 160 million cubic meters per day that is non-deliverable in the event of a shutdown in Ukrainian gas transit. It's also worth noting that currently the use of Nord Stream is restricted by disputes with the EU over the status of Nord Stream's onshore sections in Germany, these being the Opal and Nel gas pipelines, and that there is a lack of connection currently to bring Nord Stream and Yamal Europe gas south beyond the Czech Republic and Austria to the states of Central and Southeast Europe. So that's the situation as it stands. So now we ask the question, in the event of an interruption of gas transit via Ukraine, how would these states cope? Well, the point to be made here is that gas storage would be crucial. So again, what we have here is data from Gas Infrastructure Europe, looking at how much gas each of these states had in storage on the first day of the winter heating season, so from the 31st of October. And then comparing that to the daily imports via Ukraine in January 2014, and by simply, putting the two figures together, we can sort of approximately estimate how many days these countries could draw upon their gas storage as a replacement for imports via Ukraine, just for that. And for again, I will draw your attention to the figure in red at the bottom here. The regional total assumes that if we take all of these countries together as a single geographical entity, imagine that they are all completely interconnected and that they can share all of their gas storage between them, then they could last for approximately 3 months. The regional average is basically the average of the column on the right there. So for those countries that do have access to gas storage, then they could last for an average of 319 days. So if we're taking the best case scenario in terms of the sharing of gas storage and cross-border interconnections, we would say that regionally speaking, these states could cope for approximately 3 months. It's also worth noting that on the 31st of October of this year, the gas storage facilities in the region, particularly in Austria, Bulgaria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Germany, Italy, Poland, Serbia, and Slovakia were more than 90% full. The gas storage facilities in Hungary were more than 70% full, although Hungary does have a very large gas storage capacity relative to its daily gas use. What about those without gas storage? Well, clearly, access to alternative supplies and gas storage in neighbouring states would be vital. Italy and Greece both have access to LNG supplies. So, for example, in January 2014, Greece imported approximately 9 million cubic meters per day of natural gas via Ukraine, but had around 12 million cubic meters per day of spare LNG import capacity. Again, if we look at some of the specific cases, Serbia would be very reliant on gaining cross-border access to Hungarian gas storage facilities. Slovenia has cross-border connections and could potentially access extra supplies from Italy or Austrian gas storage, and for Croatia, supplies from Austrian or Hungarian gas storage. So again, if I'll draw your attention back to the map here to see how these individual states are connected across borders. So if we look at the current gas stocks in Austria and Hungary, particularly, we see that they are crucial to regional energy security. However, much depends on the cross-border connections that allows them, if they are willing, to share gas with their regional partners. But we're left with two energy islands, Bulgaria and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. They both lack sufficient gas storage, but they also lack cross-border connections with their neighbours. I consulted a Romanian energy expert, Dr. Radu Duda, on this, and he explained to me that, quite simply, Bulgaria and Macedonia cannot use gas storage from Romania because the transit pipeline is not connected to the rest of the Romanian grid. So when Russian gas is delivered via Ukraine and then onward to Romania and onward to Bulgaria and then hence to Macedonia, there is the transit pipelines simply pass straight through. They're not sufficiently connected. There is work currently being undertaken on a Bulgaria-Romania interconnector that could be completed by the end of 2014, but this is already more than a year overdue, and there is a degree of skepticism as to whether this will actually be completed by the end of the calendar year. There are also plans for an interconnector between Greece and Bulgaria, but that is also overdue, and construction is now scheduled for 2015-16. So, for the moment, Bulgaria remains somewhat isolated. So, some conclusions. Quite simply, it's very clear from the data that we have that Central and Southeastern Europe is far more dependent on Russian gas and on Ukrainian gas transit than the rest of Europe. But the dependency cuts two ways. Russia is also still dependent on Ukrainian gas transit for its deliveries to Europe, and particularly to Central and Southeastern Europe. So we see that gas storage facilities would be crucial in the event of a suspension of Russian gas deliveries via Ukraine. And indeed, the gas storage facilities in Austria and Hungary, combined with increased LNG imports by Italy and Greece, would be vital in the instance of any suspension of Ukrainian gas transit. However, we note that there have been significant improvements over the last 5 years. The regional impact during the previous Russia-Ukraine gas dispute in January 2009 was quite significant in the region. What we've seen since then is obviously the launch of the Nord Stream gas pipeline, which reduced both Russian and European dependency on Ukrainian gas transit. And we're seeing some improvements in cross-border connections as well. So, for example, the Czech Republic is far more integrated into the Western European gas market thanks to its cross-border connections with Germany than it was 5 years ago. However, there is still much work to be done. Bulgaria and Macedonia still exist as energy islands. So clearly we need to complete the interconnections with Greece and Romania. In terms of looking forward, the implementation of the TANAP TAP project will be very important for the region. And South Stream is rather controversial. Obviously, it has its critics in Europe, especially in Brussels. But for these states of Central and Southeast Europe, it offers them the chance to reduce their dependency on Ukrainian gas transit. However, it retains their dependency on Russian gas imports. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. How am I on for time? Is that about right?
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. Yes, Jack. Thank you very much.
Excellent. As a slight technical note, by the way, the data that we had on gas storage came from Gas Infrastructure Europe, and it's worth noting that when you look at this statistics, just to explain for those who are not familiar, the total amount of gas storage capacity is the maximum volume of gas that can be stored in an underground gas storage facility. Now that requires base or cushion gas. So it's the volume of gas intended as a permanent inventory in a storage reservoir to maintain pressure. So this is not withdrawn. So the working gas capacity refers to the total gas storage minus this base or cushion gas. And from sort of looking at the data in detail, it's clear that the figures from Gas Infrastructure Europe refer to working gas, just in case there is some question mark over this. But again, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jack, for another very interesting presentation. We will start the question and answer session for 15 to 20 minutes, followed by a 15 minutes break before we get into the second session. So anyone who has a question, please raise your hand for the mic. State your name, who you represent, and who would you want to ask the question to. Meanwhile, I have a question for you, Sarah. You did mention about the ministerial changes in the oil and gas sector, and I wanted to know how is that going to affect the commodity prices. We've seen a decline today, in the past couple of weeks. So the instability per se of the region, and if we foresee more changes in these key roles, is that would be due to these changes in the commodity prices, or is it going to be affecting this market of the oil and gas sector? Yes, please push on the...
Thanks for your question. If I understood correctly, you were talking about international commodity market or Iran's market?
No, the international commodity.
International commodity. Well, I think that, mainly that international commodity market is being affected by the price plunge or the insecurity in certain parts of the Middle East. So I don't see that mainly as the other way.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Ali.
My name is Dr. Ali Lamoudi. I'm from a Sustainable Environmental Advisor in Takrir Adnoc, Abu Dhabi. I would like to thank Dr. Sarah and Dr. Jack for such informative and very knowledgeable presentations. I have a question for Dr. Sarah.
Sure.
Do you think that is there any changes in Iran's energy policy among the current nuclear crisis issue from the sanction of UN and EU, and to what extent it affects Iran's foreign relationship? Thank you.
Thanks for your good question. You're talking about the changes. Well, first of all, I would say that Iran, when we talk about energy policy, it's very different from nuclear policy. So Iranian have a Ministry of Petroleum, which is in charge of oil, gas, petrochemical, but the nuclear energy is different. So it's not like some countries, like in United States, Department of Energy is also in charge of nuclear energy. So the policy is different. How the policy changed, the new minister has much different approach to the previous one. He has the share fields. Iran has 14 share fields with its neighboring countries, and that's the highest priority for him. Natural gas, production from natural gas fields, increasing Iran's natural gas and condensate production, producing more gasoline and petrochemical factories are his highest and top priorities. With regard to the second part of your question, that P5+1 and the sanctions, again, as I mentioned, I know that the sanctions that have been set on Iran from European Union side or United Nations are the first one to ease on Iran rather to American sanctions. And for American sanctions, when we look into each sanctions, we should look at the origination of each sanctions. If this sanctions has been set on Iran because of its nuclear activity, or it was because of the support for terrorism, because the State Department has certain groups that, for instance, Hezbollah is part of the terrorist list for the United States. So supporting Iran's support of Hezbollah or Hamas was leading to, for instance, in 1996, Iran Sanction Act. So the origination of these sanctions was not Iran's nuclear activity. So if Iran reaches to an agreement for its nuclear activity with P5+1, the Iran Sanction Act is not going to be removed, because then the State Department requires Iran to stop supporting certain groups that the US call them as terrorists, and they have different originations. But sanctions, particularly since 2010, that they were targeted Iran's economy, oil export, revenue, foreign assets, that our origination, their origination was Iran's nuclear program, they could start relieving and ease on Iran.
Okay. Next question.
Hello, I'm Imad from the Petroleum Institute. My question is to Mr. Jack. If you would assume that the countries that have this huge gas storage that would share with the rest, why you wouldn't assume that they would help to pay the debt as well? So they can help to pay the debt rather than just after cutting the supplier, they can share their storage or gas storage. Yes.
Thank you for your question. Apologies. So when we wrote the paper, we included this gas storage and the assumption that it would be shared as a statistical modeling device, let's say. The idea of energy solidarity in a crisis is also something that's strongly promoted by the European Commission. However, it's not guaranteed. It's not guaranteed. A lot depends on market conditions as to whether the companies that own the gas that is in storage would be willing to actually take it out of storage and deliver it to neighboring countries. So in that sense, we cannot be entirely sure as to what would happen in the event of a crisis. This was rather more a hypothetical example. Obviously, if the gas that was in storage is not shared, then the situation for those countries that don't have gas storage of their own becomes much the worse. And I think that this is something that we also need to be very aware of. A further point that I didn't mention in the presentation is that by looking at the amount of gas that is in storage as a regional total, and assuming that it would be shared, the other thing that we should remember, and this is something that will come out in more detail in the paper, I just thought it was a little complex to start trying to discuss in the presentation, is that it assumes absolute cross-border connectivity between all of these states, which at the moment is not quite the case. This also assumes that gas can be moved around from one part of the country to another without problem. And again, this is not quite the case. And this would require more research to find out exactly what is the situation in each individual country. So, for example, if Romania even did decide to help out with Bulgaria and Macedonia, would Bulgaria have the possibility to bring that gas in from Romania and then transfer it across to Macedonia? Would there be bottlenecks on the Bulgarian-Macedonian border, for example? So this is something that we're still working on, but at the moment it seems that this is a very optimistic scenario. Let's say that in the event of a crisis, that the gas that's actually in storage could be shared, that there would be both the willingness and the technical capacity to do so. And I think if we were being a little more pessimistic, we would say that the willingness may or may not be there, and the technical capacity to share this gas is also something that is not entirely certain. So no, thank you for your question. I'm glad that that was raised as an issue. Thank you.
There's another question in the back.
Thank you. My name is Ahmed Al-Safti. I'm from the ECSSR. Actually, I have a question for both of you about the longer term. What role China could play in both situations? It's as simple as that. Thank you.
Sarah, would you like to go first? Yeah. Okay. Well, my area of expertise is Russia, so I will answer from that perspective. Obviously, you know, we've been looking here at the role that Russia plays as a gas exporter to Europe. Now, whether the China factor would change this looking forward, obviously this summer we saw the signing of a major gas deal between Gazprom and the China National Petroleum Corporation. The framework agreement stipulated 68 BCM per year. The contract that was actually signed in the summer was for 38 BCM per year for 30 years. However, the two sides have now, and that was to be delivered via the so-called eastern route. So from Russian gas fields in eastern Siberia to be delivered via the Power of Siberia pipeline and to cross the border into China, somewhere around Khabarovsk, let's say, or Blagoveshchensk, somewhere around there. What's important to note is that this deal was really predicated on the development of East Siberian gas fields. This is new gas production. This is not gas production that was aimed for Europe. Gazprom, as the monopoly pipeline gas exporter from Russia, has over the last, let's say, 5 to 7 years, invested rather a lot of money in new gas production, but on the Yamal Peninsula and in the Yamal region of northern Russia, and this was primarily aimed at Europe. If we know that Russian gas production has traditionally been concentrated in northwest Siberia, but these mature fields are now declining in their production level. And so Gazprom has already made the investment in new gas production up at Yamal. They launched the Bovanenkovo gas field on the Yamal Peninsula in 2012. They've already constructed new pipelines to bring that gas to European Russia for export onto Europe. So when we talk about China in this sense, the deal that was signed in summer doesn't really touch Russian gas exports to Europe in that sense. You could almost divide Russia down the middle and say that it's almost like two countries, I guess, two separate gas industries almost. Now, what's interesting is that the two sides have recently started discussing gas supplies via the so-called Western route, which would pass through Russia's Altai region. Russia and China actually share a 50-kilometer wide border in this region, and they're discussing the potential for another 30 BCM to be delivered via this route. Now, what's interesting here is that this would draw upon gas that is currently being produced either in northwest Siberia or Yamal, potentially. But even this, I think, shouldn't affect the amount of gas that is available for Europe too much, because since the launch of the Bovanenkovo field 2 years ago, it's operated far below its technical capacity, simply because there hasn't been the level of gas demand that Gazprom had maybe predicted or hoped for when it launched this project. So at the moment, I think it's quite possible to have the two directions of exports, let's say, operating at the same time without there being a significant impact of one on the other. Whether that's still the case come 2025, 2030, when the northwest Siberian gas fields are truly depleted and the gas that is intended for export to Europe is coming almost predominantly from the Yamal region, then there might be the possibility for playing off the one against the other. So this is something of very, very long term. In the period from now to say 2020, maybe even 2025, it shouldn't affect things too much. Going further, that's where the pivot is going to be, let's say.
Thanks, Jack. Sarah, do you want to?
Well, at this point, two scenarios can happen for Iran. One is that if Iran reaches to an agreement with P5+1, if this happens, certain sanctions will start to ease on Iran. It's not a one-night process, so it's going to take years for all these sanctions to completely remove from Iran. Under this scenario, Iran's production is going to increase 500,000 to 600,000 barrels. Within 3 to 6 months, Iran's production is going to increase to a certain amount, and then they're going to attract their attention on, once again, to bring back the investors with the focus on shale fields, particularly gas fields. If, under the other scenario, Iran doesn't reach to the agreement, well, the people that already are in power are going to have to handle the power, once again, to the hardliners, people that once they were saying that if Iran cannot sell a drop of oil, they're not going to let anyone else to sell oil, and the things could escalate. So that's the two different scenarios we could have.
Thank you.
But personally, I think that at this moment, the prices of oil are very low. And Iran, because of the sanctions and limitations on its export, cannot increase its export amount to cover this budget deficit. I think Iranians' stake to reach to an agreement with P5+1 is at highest ever. So I think that they have their highest priority to reach to an agreement.
Thank you, sir. We have a couple of questions here in the front row, please.
Thank you very much. I have two questions, one for Dr. Jack, one for Dr. Sarah. Regarding the Syrian crisis, we would like to know if this can affect and regarding the near future, the far future, is that has any effect on the gas supply from Russia to European Union. And we would like to know clearly about it, particularly that Syria announced that they have gas also. Okay. For Dr. Sarah, actually many educated people in the Middle East, is it clear, my question? Regarding the Iranian, many educated people in the Middle East believe that the Iranian policy actually does not change since the revolution of the Khomeini until now. It changed in the extent, not in the policy itself. And many people believe that the American sanctions actually is not a tied sanction. It's not, America is not quite keen in applying the sanction over Iran because they can sell gas and they have so many ways and so many ways to sell gas and oil in the people believe that many educated people and in the Middle East some of confidential collaborations with Iran behind the stages. They that it's happening in the real world. What's happening after the crisis of Iraq and the domination of Iran over Iraq and the aggressive policy actually of Iran to dominate in political terms and in economic terms over the states of the Arabian Gulf states and something like that. I want you to make it clear. Is that belief is right or we have some doubts? Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Well, thanks for your comments. Well, I'm consider myself as an energy expert, and I try not to be a geopolitical genius and have an answer for all the questions, especially to evaluate that if all these experts and educated people, how they're thinking. With the first part of your comments, I agree with you that Iranian policy doesn't change necessarily. The strategy, the long-term strategy is the same. The shape might change. The methodology might change, same as the United States. One day Republicans are ruling, the other day Democrats. They might be different in the way they're looking at things, or smaller agendas, but on the macro level, US national interest is never going to be changed. And I agree with you with that part. With the other part, actually, there was a big conference at the end of last month, Arab-US policy-making conference every year in Washington, D.C. I was in energy panel, but I heard other speakers, including Prince Turki Faisal of Saudi Arabia. I heard there are many anger toward Iran's activities in Syria, and they see things differently. That Iran is saying they're accusing U.S. of not supporting the Arab countries enough, or letting Iran's dominance to increase. I rather just to speak about energy issues, but I agree with most part of your comments.
Okay, so thank you for your question. I'm aware that we don't have a lot of time, so I will be brief. From the European perspective, rather, some would say fortunately, Syria does not really impact upon the delivery of Russian gas to Europe. I would say that in that perspective, we're quite comfortable with the amount of not only reserves but production capacity that Russia has relative to European demand, and that the main issue really is Ukraine currently, and the stability of gas transit via Ukraine, given not only the contractual relations between Gazprom and Naftogaz, but also obviously the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine. So in this sense, Syria is not really a factor in EU-Russia gas relations. But
We have one last question here for the time.
I would like to thank the center that held the conference on these very important issues. But my question is to Dr. Sarah. I would like to say your presentation was very useful for us.
Thank you.
And my question is that this week is the Iran week. And I wrote an article that one politician said if Iran will not sign the agreement this week, it will not sign at all. Is it right? I want your expectation about what's happening this week and what they will happen if Iran will not sign the agreement with the European and United States, 5+1 specifically. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks for your kind comments about my presentation and your very good question. Again, I go back also to the comments of the gentleman prior to yours. I agree, and many people know that Iran's policy doesn't change, including the United States. I mean, I believe that they know what Iranians really think or what is their strategy. The whole point of reaching to an agreement is to make Iran or put Iran under some certain obligations or certain controls. And the reason is that they think, at least in Washington, D.C., that if Iran was under many sanctions in previous years, but their nuclear program developed. Their energy program, their energy industry was not very much, but the number of their centrifuges was increased massively, even though they were under sanction. So the question is that if you want to have Iran under control with bringing Iran to a table to sign an agreement and agree to certain obligations, or just let Iran be free under the sanctions. So at this point, I think that's the perspective is not that because U.S. is necessarily not supporting certain allies or supporting Iran. But with regard to your question that if Iran is going to sign or if never going to sign, there is a very strong opposition to the current president that they are looking forward for any opportunity to stop any further progress because they don't want to accept any obligations. They had, first of all, there are power centers in Iran that are making profit from being Iran under sanctions. So first of all is their group profit. The second is that when they are under their obligation, they have to be responsible, and they don't want that. And they're looking for that opportunity. So I think that that analysis, to a certain degree, could be correct, that if Rouhani's administration, the current foreign minister, Mr. Zarif, if they couldn't reach to an agreement, if they couldn't sign it, immediately these groups that are against the deal are going to get the higher hand and they're going to take this opportunity. And I think that, I personally think that the world without agreement would be tougher because we saw how they behaved, although they were under massive sanctions. I know the prices of crude oil has dropped, so their revenue, of course, is much limited than before, and sanctions are going to be tougher. Already the sanctions in Congress are ready for the scenario that Iran doesn't sign, and there are massive secondary sanctions that are going to target Iran massively. So I think both sides knows the consequences. So Iranians know they are at their maximum need for reach to this agreement for their economy, for different reasons, energy industry, and the secondary sanctions that could target them. On the other hand, there are groups in Iran that are hoping that things doesn't work that way. So I again agree with the gentleman that policy might not necessarily change the national interest or the bigger look. But the thing is that Iran's nuclear policy under Mr. Khatami was different from Iran's nuclear policy during Ahmadinejad. Iran's supreme leader is the same person. So many people, they just argue that, okay, everything is decided by supreme leader of Iran, so no matter who is the president. But we saw the different approach. So this means that Iran, actually, there are different power centers that they try to balance their power. And it depends that how much power you give to how the balance of power change. So Iran is not a country that one person, supreme leader, necessarily decides or has that power to decide everything. Because the history, at least, proved of history of two previous presidents and the current one, from Khatami to now, that different administrations, different power centers being in power, the balance of power could change, and not one person could necessarily change things. So I think that's why Washington, D.C. is very eager to reach to an agreement with Tehran, and that's what they want to change this balance of power, at least to the favor of people that are more responsible.
Thank you very much. I will have to apologize. There are many other questions but we have run out of time. So please do approach us. We will have 15 minutes break before the next session starts. Do approach any of us during the break, and we will be able to assist with any more questions. Thank you very much for everybody.